Namaskar and welcome to In Focus. The 5 tests in Pokhran have surprised India and stunned the world. But whilst international reaction has protested very strongly, here at home the government has stayed very silent. Today, to help us understand what's happened and to try and look at what now happens next, we have with us the former Prime Minister of India and perhaps the country's greatest living expert on foreign policy, Indra Kumar Gujral. Mr. Gujral, you've supported these tests. Let me begin by asking you, why were they necessary?
I would put it differently, Karan. The world knew, and all of us knew, it was no secret, that India is a threshold power. What does that mean? It means that everybody believed that we have nuclear weapons, or we have nuclear capability. It was called by different names.
But why did we have to spell it out?
I'm coming to that. You have it. Now, even in the CTBT treaty agreement, they had said there are some threshold powers. But they were projecting it like this, that powers that are threshold, they must also sign. Why did they ask us? Because they were indirectly trying to imply, basically, that these 3 threshold powers are nuclear, only this has not been exposed.
So by testing, we've moved from threshold to full-fledged.
That's correct, number one, but more important. I think it is far more dangerous to have an untested weapon. It is much better for the world and for us that here we are, it is a tested weapon. We are not going to militarize it, but please talk to us. How do we create atmosphere around us and everywhere where we are not faced with any nuclear threat?
So now, in fact, our testing has made the region and the world safer because ours is a tested weapon.
You see, this point, I think indirectly I had made to President Clinton when I met him last year, and also Madam Albright when she came here. What did I tell them? I told them, Mr. President, draw in your mind a map of India and then start looking around it. We have nearly 1,000 miles long border with Tibet or China, whatever you want to call it. There is a neighbor that should always concern us. That neighbor is nuclearized. Then, Mr. President, you must know that we are in the Indian Ocean. And in Indian Ocean there is a place called Diego Garcia. Nuclearized, nuclear weapons. Within the range, India is within their range. Thanks to mistakes or whatever of Saddam Hussein, today you have so many flotillas in the Gulf. Many of them have nuclear weapons.
These are the threat perceptions you saw at the time?
At the time I presented it to him.
And what did he say?
He said, I understand. And I asked him, Mr. President, if you were me, what would you do? The fact that he understood it, actually diplomats never call a spade a spade. They always choose to call it by another name.
But how did he reply to that question?
But the response you are asking, what the President's response was, spelled out by 2 things. He decided to come to India. And he sent his Secretary of State, Madam Albright. 20 years ago, a President of America had come here. And I think nearly the same time when the last Foreign Secretary of America had come to us.
So what you're saying, Mr. Gujral, is that after your meetings with President Clinton in New York, the Americans understood the security and threat perceptions of India as you presented it. That's why these visits took place.
You see, kindly understand one thing. American sources of information, to say the least, are extremely good. America also understands the Pacific. He understands which powers are present in Pacific and Indian Ocean together.
And presumably America does not want China to be the only nuclear power in the Pacific either.
Our main approach to America has been that our initial perception of a foreign policy is based on non-alignment. We would not like to, we never joined any camp which vis-a-vis Soviet Union. We would not like to join any camp vis-a-vis China. But also at the same time, we have to remain conscious of the map that I have drawn before your mind, that how India stands and where India has to safeguard its interests.
Let me ask you this. Why did you, when you were Prime Minister, not find it necessary to carry out these steps?
You see, this debate has been going on whether to test or not to test or when to test ever since Mr. Narasimha Rao's time. And I am sharing perhaps a secret with you that every government that came, last 4 or 5 governments, Mr. Narasimha Rao's, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee for 13 days, Mr. Deve Gowda, myself, and now Mr. Vajpayee again. This has been a file on our table all the time. Only thing one had to judge that how necessary it is and when is it necessary to have a test.
Timing was the important thing.
Timing is a matter of judgment again, because there is no textbook available where one should refer to a dictionary as what is the exact time.
People say that you are perhaps the best judge of foreign policy, timing and initiatives. Let me ask you a simple question. Do you, in your opinion, think that this government has chosen the right time?
That is what I am repeating again. It would be unfair on my part to try to say whether the time is right or wrong. Primarily, that is for every government to judge. As I said just now, how does one decide what is the right time? One thing kindly keep in mind. Nuclear weapons, all the countries have, and the P5 and others. Nuclear weapon is not a weapon of war anymore. Nuclear weapon is a deterrent. It ensures more security, not threatens for war, but the fact that everyone knows that in your arsenal something is there.
Okay, I accept your point that timing is a question of judgment and you don't want to comment on the present Prime Minister's judgment. Tell me something else. The Prime Minister has written to heads of government abroad to explain why he did it. So far, they haven't explained to their country. Don't you find that a little strange?
You see, in democracy, 2 things always happen. And I'm not criticizing the Prime Minister. I think Prime Minister was in the midst of an action. On the 11th, the first test was made, and on 13th, the second test. So therefore, I am not criticizing the Prime Minister for not talking in details.
But don't you think he should do it now?
I think probably he will, because after all, political parties survive on communication. And how can you not communicate to a nation?
And if he doesn't do it in the next day or so, then you will begin to get a little concerned.
Well, I'm not making any ifs and buts. I have faith that he'll do it.
Let's come back to the actual tests themselves. The government has said that these are part of a series of tests. As you say, plans for this, files concerning this matter had been lying on your table and all your predecessors' tables. Is this just a one-off series, or are there other such series that are also necessary to achieve the same strategic and defense goals?
Well, I take at the face value what the Prime Minister has said, that this is the end of the series. And I don't think he's wrong.
So we should not see any further nuclear tests in
Well, I'm saying I attach credibility to Prime Minister's statement.
Let me bring up something else. After Monday's blast, there was very widespread foreign protest. And yet this was followed by 2 more on Wednesday. In the eyes of the outside world, does this look like defiance? Does it look like India snooking?
Every expert of the nuclear energy or the nuclear weapon or whatever you might choose to call it, knows full well from its own experience that you had to do a few tests to get adequate data. What is a test? You must first kindly let me explain. What is it? It presumes that you have a weapon. It presumes you want to test it. What do you want to test? You want to test its efficacy. You want to test its accurate targeting. You want to test its destruction capability. Scientifically speaking, it is not possible for any country in the world to have done it in once. Why did, for instance, America had to test 1,100 times?
So therefore 5 tests were essential.
Were the minimum necessary.
But was it necessary to spread them over 2 days?
You see, kindly keep in mind the fact that it is in order to acquire some data by the experts to test the efficacy of their own theorem regarding a weapon. Now I assume, I don't have information, I assume what they would have done is that whatever results they collected on the 11th, They would have put in the computer again, and computer would have posed some more questions.
Which
And
required tests on the
that's
Wednesday.
exactly.
Okay, let me ask you another question. How long, what is the sort of minimum period required between giving the green light and the tests happening?
Well, I think gradually we have been reducing that period.
The papers say that the green light was perhaps given on the 22nd of April. Does that sound roughly accurate to you?
Well, I don't know that because naturally I do not like to poke my nose after I've left that office.
But 3 weeks is too short, or is it sufficient?
Well, I think Indian efficacy has now reached a stage that it can be done at a very short notice.
Can you tell us how much is short?
That is difficult for me to because the experts can say it. You see, some time is taken, for instance, boring the hole. That boring had been done in Narasimha time. Bore was already there. The second question would be that how long does it take to pick up an instrument from the base where it would have been and put it in a hole there? It doesn't need much time.
So it can be done effectively within a week?
Well, again, I'm hesitating to exactly tell you how much, but I think it should be sufficient for me to tell you that it doesn't need much time.
And as you also said, the actual hole was bored in former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's time.
Yes, Americans have noticed it, and Americans protested against it.
Let me come to one other thing. This government, when it came to power, in its national agenda, in its speeches in Parliament, said that the decision to induct nuclear weapons would be taken only after a strategic defense review. Now, has that review been held? Have they forgotten about it? Have they changed their mind?
You see, there are certain jargons in diplomacy. Security Council in India does not exist. Appointment of 3 members to try to work out a blueprint is in the infancy. We have done it several times. I did it in time of VP Singh's government when I was foreign minister. I have undertaken the exercise now again as a prime minister. You know, it is a very long and agonizing exercise.
So you're saying that the strategic defense review probably was done, but it wasn't done by a Security Council, as they said.
Security
it was done by
Council
1 or 2 people.
Security Council does not exist.
So it was done by 1 or 2 people.
Ultimate responsibility is of the cabinet.
But you're confident that this was done after a strategic defense review? It wasn't done...
Sometimes the diplomats use complex words for a simple proposition. The proposition is that the threat assessment had been made as I spelled out to you. It is a known fact that since we have refused to sign the CTBT, by 1999, when the final agreement will be signed by several countries, we would be in a far more disadvantageous position than we are today. So we have to catch up with the time also. So that by the time CTBT is enforced, and if our signatures are missing at that time, then they can take some other actions against us.
So if we have to act, we have to act now.
If you have to act before that comes into force, whether it is in the month of May or in the month of September or October, December, that is naturally for the man in office to decide.
Mr. Gujral, I understand. I want to take a commercial break there. I want to come back in part 2 and ask you to help us understand what's now going to follow. But first, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're talking to former Prime Minister Indra Kumar Gujral. Mr. Gujral, let's now come to the international reaction. What response do you expect from the Nawaz Sharif government in Pakistan?
One point I must make clear, that is that whether in office or outside, I have been a great votary of good relations with the neighbors, and Pakistan occupies a very prominent position in that. In my government, and I think in the other governments, style may have differed, but this is our commitment that India and Pakistan should have very good friendly neighborhood relations.
So how then will they react
But I'll
now?
come to it later now. Second point is that, having said this, my foreign policy since I came in office was multi-pronged. And one of the prongs of this was that India's foreign policy would no more be Pakistan-centric. And it was not. That is why we didn't respond to any statements.
So in effect, you're saying it doesn't really matter how they respond. That
No,
shouldn't be our
I'm not saying
concern.
that. I'm only saying this thing, that the vital decisions in Indian security are not taken because of Pakistan. Because I spelled out the Indian
I
neighborhood.
accept that completely. But Do you believe now that the Pakistanis will move to carry out their own nuclear test explosion?
Well, if they want to do it, who am I to stop them? And I think it is a correct thing that every country has to decide its own security compulsions.
Okay, let me ask you to analyze the situation. Suppose they were in the next week or so to carry out a nuclear test explosion. How would that affect the situation vis-à-vis India?
Well, it might sound cynical, but if they were deterrent and we were deterrent, then I think like wise people and wise leaders, we should address the situation in that context. And that would mean what? When both sides are deterrent, the wars are out. So therefore, let us talk.
So in other words, if they actually do carry out their own explosion, it could bring about a balance in relationship, in
I'm
deterrence.
hesitating to give adjectives to this. I'm only saying this thing that every country in the world which had provided deterrence, it has provided balanced discussions.
So a Pakistani test wouldn't necessarily be a retrograde
I
step.
put it differently. We all know that, or assume, and Pakistan has said several times, that they have nuclear weapons. Would testing make any qualitative difference?
Let me ask you the same question about India. Everyone knew that we had nuclear weapons. Why was it necessary for us to test?
For our own reasons, I said in the while ago, my scientists and technologists wanted to know and test the efficacy of it. Because whenever they fed the data in the computer, question marks came.
And they wanted to remove the question marks.
Yes.
Okay, let's come to the sanctions. Perhaps the most worrying sanctions are those that are going to be imposed by America. You've been Prime Minister. You know the Americans. You also know the state of our economy. Would we be vulnerable to international, particularly American sanctions?
You see, the misfortune is that although the Cold War is ended, and we are talking all the time in terms of New World Order, it is an unbalanced world order. And on every small issue, they try to isolate us. When I refused to sign CTBT, they isolated us because I lost the UN election at that time. And they try to make me feel that you are alone and 149 are on the other side. You see, when you take decisions which you perceive that in your national interest, then it is nothing new nor novel if some people talk of high-handed manners. But I do hope one thing, that Indo-American relationships have covered a lot of ground in the positive sense. You remember my discussions with President Clinton. You remember my discussions with the Secretary of State. You remember what they've been writing to me after that. Keeping all that in mind, I am sure that when they come to sit down at the table, they will see the disadvantages in enforcing elections.
Let me ask...
Sanctions, not elections. Let me give one more minute. You see, I had told some ambassadors who came to meet me from Australia, I told them, don't take a step which pushes us into radical lines. Sanctions, etc., and effort to isolate us will give birth here to ultra-radicalism, which is not in the interest of anybody. I think it is the interest of the world and India also that we stay sober, we stay democratic, and no attempt is made to isolate us or to bully us.
There are plans to hold national victory celebrations on Saturday. Do you think those are mistaken?
Well, that is where I returned to Prime Minister yesterday. I have asked him that let us not make it look that is a party's achievement. Nuclear weapons were not made yesterday. Nuclear capability was not acquired yesterday.
But have you also said that these sort of plans for national victory celebrations would be misunderstood?
Yes, I am coming to that. Therefore, it will be totally counterproductive if it is projected as a party's victory, because that will break the consensus. And also, if euphoric IT has taken sweets and all that, you will only push the outside world to think of you as chauvinistic country. We are not chauvinistic. It is a serious decision that has been taken. And therefore, we have to behave with utmost sobriety.
And we have to temper our celebration and jubilation.
We don't have to celebrate. What have we to celebrate?
Have we become, in the eyes of industrialists, the press, the governments abroad, a rogue state? Have we become a pariah state?
Total nonsense. How does one become a rogue state? We are a responsible democracy, which is sensitive to world opinion. We are keen to get into Security Council. We are functioning as very active members of every international forum. We are very keen that with the major powers of the world, our relationship should be more abiding, and I'm certain it will continue. I don't think it's a question of rogue state or
Then let me come to my last question. Is this the time now, having completed successfully 5 tests, for us to say we'll sign the CTBT?
Yes, I think time is there, but I also go with the government when you say we'll discuss CTBT. Please keep in mind the fact CTBT has several clauses, and one of the clauses is that it is discriminatory. It may no more be discriminatory against us, but as a world power, we have to ensure that it is a just treaty.
Can you sign and then say we would like the unjust clauses to be amended after we've signed?
Well, these both things can be discussed. I do not know what the Prime Minister will decide. But I think one gesture has been given, it should be repeated, that within the broad framework of CTBT, which bans tests, and tests of all types, the test which America is performing on a computer, the test which France is performing on a computer, let us come down and sit together and say, we are from now onwards banning all tests. Let us also come to a conclusion, all of us together, that methodically we will destroy the nuclear weapons. India will join it. We have proved once.
That's the condition on which you think we should join.
I am not saying as a condition. Condition is a wrong word. But I think there should be our effort to persuade the world powers that let us look at it comprehensively and spell out the objectives on which we want India to come on board. I think India should have no hesitation.
My last question, if you were Prime Minister, what steps would you have taken to reassure the nation, to remove a sense of emerging fear, perhaps anxiety, perhaps in places panic? What steps would you take?
Well, I would only make my country look at this subject with all seriousness and not as a mela. I would make my country enlightened on the subject and make them appreciate that security is a serious business, but we have also to live in this world, and this we must have maximizing efforts all the time.
So you would take the country into confidence and speak to them?
Yes, of course.
You would do something the Prime Minister hasn't done so far?
I think he'll do it. I have sympathy with the situation. I'm not criticizing him.
What about the outside world? If you were Prime Minister, what steps would you take to assure the outside world that we continue to remain committed to non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament?
Well,
how would you reassure them of our credentials?
If I may take you in confidence, only yesterday I've written to Prime Minister on the subject. I'll read that relevant para only, not the whole letter. This relevant para I've said, and I quote unquote, it would be advantageous to take timely view in regard to the revised position on CTBT and to let it be known. If this is done, it would help the nuclear weapon powers and other major economic powers to adopt a moderate approach in regard to threatened sanctions. In brief, we have to provide a suitable opening to Washington, Bonn, Tokyo and others to maintain their expected postures and responses without any tangible harm being done to our national and economic interests, especially the later in the short term. Our ability, I continue, our ability to timely clean the air in regard to CTBT and soon enough in regard to FMCT, that is the fissionable material, would assist in normalization of the entire situation. This would enable us to proceed apace without adversely affecting economic development programs. Delay in making our policy positions would correspondingly lay the basis for more hardened and negative approaches emanating from the quarters which have the potential to harm our national interests.
That's very clear, Mr. Gujral. You're very clearly saying to the government, this is the time for you to make a gesture, make it unequivocally, make it quickly. For that,
make it persistently.
And make
it persuasively.
Thank you very much indeed for speaking so openly to InFocus. That's it for this week. InFocus will be back next week with another interview, but for today, from former Prime Minister Inder Kumar Gujral's residence in New Delhi, goodbye.